Early on the first morning of the first day of the rest of their lives, Mary and Salome and the other Mary, which is not the Mary you think that it might be, it's another Mary still, these three set out to do the human work of death. There's always so much to do when someone dies. There's the funeral and the service and the burial details. There's also the paperwork and the packing and the delivering of things that turns out you can't take with you, delivering to loved ones and thrift shops. There's the receiving of food, casseroles or fruit baskets that come from friends as a way of saying, you've got so much on your plate. Here, let me make you a plate. Or don't forget to tend to your body. There's travel, or, well, there used to be. And there's the calling of some religious authority, rabbi or priest, funeral director or pastor, who is allegedly going to make it all make sense and help us through our unimaginable grief. Many of us have been there, right? Early in the morning of the first day of the rest of our lives after someone has died. For those of us who have commended a parent or a sibling or a spouse, a best friend, a lover, or, God have mercy, a child. Time moves differently on that first day, early in the morning after a night when sleep may or may not have visited us. Time moves differently because the world, our world, has changed. Some of us try to make time stop, quite literally in some cases of arresting the pendulum or draping a shroud over the family clock. Or maybe it's more figurative by memorializing some chair as that was his and not letting anyone sit in it ever again, or some pair of earrings that were once loved by her that will forever sit on a dresser now. For some time moves forward and fits and starts, jerks of timelessness confused with humanity and loss and tears. It's not so much that time itself has stopped or that we can stop it, but it sure can feel that way. The last of a generation above us dies, and we feel the loss of those who witnessed our childhood, and we know that our own time is next. The loss of the gaze, the eyes that looked upon us, that someone who witnessed decades of our lives, and we wonder, who will hold these memories with me? And so, humans that we all are, we gather with others, with Marys and Salomes and Jameses and Johns and Peters, to mark the time, to tell the stories, and hold fast to whatever rituals or things to do we need to do to get through the day, early in the morning as it is. Death, of course, is no metaphor. We know it is for real. We know there's no escaping it. There's only one way out of this thing called life, and we know there comes a point in each of our lives when there's no going back. Death, too, is a metaphor, one we like to employ for any number of things. For every day there is a little death, a little sting. Death is not just the tomb and the mortician and the spices and the shrouds, but also the loss and the grief, the mourning and the coping and the longing that comes each evening as day comes to close and the gift of tomorrow has yet to be revealed. There's no going back or undoing the things that we've done that we wish we hadn't, or of saying something different than what came out of our mouths. Death has a certainty, a finality, a directedness that we sense in the dying and the dawning of each moment. This has been a year where death has lingered round our doorframes a little longer and maybe a little closer than usual, a little longer than we would have liked. All of us have become no stranger to death this year, and I venture to say there have been many moments for each of us that have felt like deaths in our own lives. The death of a morning commute might have been welcomed, whereas the death of a weekly dinner with friends or of travel plans, high school graduations, or the beginning of a new career, not so much. We've all lost people. In some years, despite our best theological intentions, Lent doesn't restrict itself to the 40 days we allow it on the calendar. Some years, Lent lingers as if to say, don't rush me, I am death itself, which is to say that I am mystery. And this year has been most mysterious indeed. As we are moving forward early in these days when vaccinations are turning the tide, there will be no going back. Time moves in but one direction. In an opinion article I'm sure many of you have already read this week, David Brooks writes of how he is trying to describe a year in which we've all been physically hunkered down, and how it has induced, among other things, a greater potential for change. Though he, like me, like I imagine many of you, is burned out on screens and the politicization of everything, David Brooks writes that people who have endured an era of vulnerability emerge with great strength. To my ear, this sounds like women strong enough to be at a tomb because they were human enough to be in a cross. Brooks is optimistic about this human strength, and I want to agree with him when he writes that the second half of this year is going to be more fantastic than we can imagine right now. We are going to become hyper appreciators, he writes, savoring every small pleasure, living in 1,000 delicious moments, getting together with friends and strangers and seeing them with the joy of new and grateful eyes. I want this, of course. I also want us to be appreciators. Forget the hyper. Let's just start with appreciating. Appreciating differences of lives that are different than ours, of lives who need more support than ours, of lives society has said for too long don't matter, that we say do matter. I want us to be working for dignity for all, and I want us standing up when we can against oppression. Brooks writes about this current phenomena as a social phenomena and as one that will affect our psychology, which of course it is. But this moment, what you know, is that it's a deeply theological phenomena as well. What Brooks is writing about is the work of resurrection, the work of faith for a second half of the year that is, quite frankly, not this half of the year. This is a faith that begins with hope, that looks forward with love, that operates with gratitude, and that seeks grace through works of justice. This is not going backward. This is not even going back. This is moving forward. Resurrection, we like to think, is a terrific metaphor. The daffodil and the tulip bulbs spring forth from cold, barren ground, proclaiming, I am not dead, nor do I sleep, I am alive. An old friend sends an email or posts a picture, and a relationship long since out of mind comes back with 1,000,000 tiny jolts of love for the life that is shared. A city, our city. Well, hibernating for over a year, we're all ready to talk of this resurrection, am I right? If we were in church, I would be encouraging you, and Pastor Bridget would be leading us in an amen to the resurrection. We are ready for our church, our city, ourselves, our world. Am I right? Amen? Resurrection is such a good metaphor for the year of death and loss that we've endured. Resurrection is needed. We look to the flowers and the trees and the subway timetables and extending grocery store hours and restaurant capacity rates and who can go to school and how long and travel restrictions and CDC guidelines. All is proof all around us that resurrection is so much more than metaphor, but it's real. And it's in our lives, which of course it is. Resurrection is also something very much more. Early on that first Easter morning, 3 women heard an angel tell them not to be alarmed, while staring into an empty tomb where they were certain they had laid the body of Jesus just before the Sabbath. A likely story, them not being amazed and terrified. And you know this about me. You know this is what I love about the angels so much, that they're always telling us not to be afraid at moments of life that are, quite frankly, utterly horrifying. Have you ever met an angel? I haven't. By all scriptural accounts, I'm perfectly fine with that. The women, however, listened to what the angels had to say. They took it all in. They were seized. Seized, that's Mark's word. Seized with terror and amazement, and they ran. They knew they couldn't go back, that they had to go forward. But first there was this feeling, well, it was all just a bit too much. We've all been there, right? That feeling of being so overwhelmed that threatens to make us run as fast and as far as our legs can carry us. Resurrection is a very good metaphor involving tulips rising from the ground. It's also a very terrifying prospect when it involves rising humans from the grave. A mystery. Resurrection is nice when we see the signs of spring. But it is also a mystery, the truth, the wisdom, the knowledge, the understanding of God that surpasses all human understanding. This is a day, the prophet Isaiah tells us, when God will swallow up death forever. That verse that Priscilla just read us, a day when God will swallow up death forever. I like to imagine that this might happen early in the morning of that day, perhaps right at dawn on the first day of the week after the divine Sabbath, God's day of rest. And early on that morning, God wakes from rest and stretches out those giant arms towards the earth and yawns. A great divine yawn, which is to say a great inhalation of breath. And in that great godly yawn, God swallows up death forever. Early in the morning on the first day of the week. And then on that same day, the work of that day, what then happens as the hours unfold, is God wiping away the tears from every face, of lifting every shroud, of lowering every mask, and calling each of us by name. On that day, which could be this day, there will be rejoicing and gladness. And on that day, which, like this day, is a day of resurrection song. Our season of Lent has begun over a year ago, and it is indeed keeping time, and it is moving us all forward in new ways. Today is our resurrection day. Today we lift our voices and look to God, who promises to always have the last word. Christ is risen today, and soon we too will rise. We will resurrect ourselves and our city and our lives. In the resurrection days that are coming, there will be no time for going back, not to the way that things were before, not to work or school or church, not to any of those things, not in quite the same way. Hopefully also not to racist policies or political divisions or discord. Hopefully those things can die. Hopefully the hate inside of each of us can die. Hopefully the loss, the grief, the mourning can be put aside, for God is doing a new thing even now. Do you not behold it? Resurrection is all around, and it is springing up even inside of yourself. It is taking the place that death has occupied for too long. And we will all be changed and transformed and resurrected. And all of the human work of death and of mourning and of grief, all of those things we know we do, well, they will require our attention. And then there are the things of resurrection that God does and God promises, and that requires no work from us at all because, well, that's the mystery. There's not a thing I can say or do to coax a bulb from the ground before it's spring. There's nothing we can say or do or believe or not believe that can raise Jesus from the grave. There is nothing we can do nor say, for nothing in all of creation can separate us from the love of God made known in Jesus, the risen Christ, this day. All of this is in God's way. All of this is in God's time and God's power, and all of this resurrection is one that God does as easily as yawning and stretching out and calling to each of us. Resurrection is for us. It's for us this day, but it belongs to God. God who alone knows the secrets of heaven and earth. God alone who knows us through and through. God alone who raises Jesus from the dead and vanquishes the power of evil. God alone who will one day, maybe even this day, swallow up all that is dead in our lives and breathe new life into us. Resurrection is like breathing out death and breathing in life. Life that both comes from and goes to God, forever forward, never going back, always led by Christ, forever and ever. Amen.